All right, so future of law, right? This is somewhat more diffuse than David's excellent, very technical presentation. But I want to try and backtrack a whole bunch of legal stuff all the way to first principles. So I did a little bit of this the last time I talked about law on this stage. This time I want to go back even further, and I want to talk about jurisdiction. Could you zoom that a little further? Now, the reason that I want to talk about jurisdiction is, I think, more important than structures like democracy. If your governing bodies are at the right kind of size, it's the switch on top. Does it look okay? Yeah, zoom in a little. So, the reason I think it's very important to think about jurisdiction first is that things like city-states, even when they ran under monarchies, tended to have relatively good governance. And this is because the people that you were dealing with that governed you were within easy reach, right? If something was very, very, very terrible in Venice, the people that were running Venice lived in Venice. They could see the problem. It was hard for them to hide. And if the situation got completely out of control, you could drag them out of their castles and lynch them. It was possible for there to be a tight feedback loop between the governed and the governors. And under modern democracies, because we're dealing with continental-sized blocks and things like nuclear weapons stockpiles, the feedback loops between the governed and the governors have become extremely weak. It's become very, very, very hard to get a signal to your government that there is a serious problem. And this notion that you vote once every 4 years by putting an X on a piece of paper is a 400-year-old mechanism. That was state-of-the-art 400 years ago. Every other single thing in your society has accelerated and accelerated and accelerated and accelerated. If voting had kept pace with mail, you would have gone from voting 4 times a year to voting 4 times a second. Right? There's been a pervasive acceleration. Government is the only thing, or at least the democratic part of government is the only thing that hasn't adapted. And as a result, there is an increasing feeling that the least functional part of all societies is the government. And this is not that surprising, because the original structural inputs to the government have not updated and not updated and not updated and not updated. If you think about, for example, Singapore was not hampered by democracy, shall we say, and under very, very talented leadership went from basically being a bunch of Chinese people stuck on a mud flat to having twice the GDP per capita of London. And they did that with no resources, no natural resources, no political goodwill. They were basically kicked out of a larger political unit against their will. They didn't want to be independent. And they've made a roaring success of it, largely because they have an extraordinarily capable and competent government. They overpay their bureaucrats massively. If anybody is corrupt, they basically shoot them. And the responsiveness to the needs of the population is very, very, very seriously a part of their set of priorities. Now, this is not a manifesto for autocracy, right? Much as I joke about being crypto-monarchist, that's basically a joke about open source software development models. The crux of the problems that we're having right now are that we have governance at the wrong scales. And if it's at the wrong scale, it's also at the wrong speed. We've basically gotten a single kind of governance, which is the governance of the nation state, and we've monopolized almost all of the power at that level. There's very little power above the nation state, and there's very little power below the nation state. And as a result, any problems which are too big for the nation state or too small for the nation state, generally speaking, bounce around the international system with no place to go. So climate change, too big for the nation state, you try and address it with a consortium of 200 nation states attempting to make binding agreements, but because these agreements are extremely costly and we can't figure out a fair way of apportioning the cost, the problem remains untouched. And the cost of inaction increases and increases and increases and increases. Scandinavia right now is so dry that they're cancelling fire festivals all the way through the summer. You can't have your summer bonfire because of the risk that the country will simply catch fire. And Scandinavia is largely made of wood. So, these things are unprecedented. They're not deeply unprecedented. They're not immediately evidential. But you sort of look at it and you're like, that's global warming, that is. So the big stuff floats over the top. The bottom layer, the small decisions, universally terrible. Like, local government is just awful. It's unresponsive everywhere. Nobody can get their potholes filled. Nobody has ever said, my goodness, this local government, it's just so enormously capable and it takes care of everything. And this is the same whether the local government is something like a homeowners association and is run as a kind of for-profit structure, or whether it's provided as part of your tax revenue. In both cases, the local government, generally speaking, has very little grip. So this idea that we have very little grip above the nation state and very little grip below the nation state, the question then is, why did we wind up in a position where our governance is all at the wrong scale? Let me push this a little further. I want to make an argument that, in fact, we're miscounting the nation states. There aren't actually 200 countries. There are actually only about 15 countries. If you define a nation state as being a thing which has a monopoly on violence inside of a geographic area, anybody without a nuclear weapon doesn't have a meaningful monopoly on violence. So, for example, Sweden is not really a country. You could think of it as being a province of Germany, and I'm aware that's a controversial opinion. But if somebody goes and invades Sweden, it's either the Germans or the Americans who are going to come and get them. Certainly nobody else is going to. And under those kind of circumstances, you have to say, well, to what degree is this a nation state in the classical sense? If it's incapable of defense, is it a principality? And if so, is it a principality of what? So that sort of model, where we've basically gone to continental level integration around nuclear weapons stockpiles, but we still have all of these provinces running around, is another way of thinking about the thinning out of power. The nuclear states seem to be making all of the decisions, which is kind of sort of why you want to be a nuclear state. But at the other side of the equation, why don't we have effective local government? The answer is no effective feedback loops. Now, this is a kind of a geographical argument. And geography is not one of these things that we think about as being a particularly important topic. Because to a very large degree, once you've got satellite mapping, you sort of think, well, why do we need geographers? Turns out geography isn't just about knowing where things are, it's about knowing what things mean. It's about the analysis of structure. So if you think of this as being a geographical problem, the question is, how do we describe the world that we live in? What is the actual structure of power? If we don't have a good description of the structure of power, it's very hard to know where you apply pressure to the system to make the system do something different. So nuclear cartel at the top table, below that a whole bunch of economically powerful principalities, and below that a whole bunch of not economically powerful principalities. Then at the bottom of that pile you basically have South America and Africa, entire continents without a single nuclear power to act as the local hegemon, and as a result they're used as dumping grounds for basically everything. Now, inside of that structure, what we have overall is a massive deficit of good governance. Right? Again, feedback loops. If the guys that are running the nuclear weapons stockpiles are the fundamental guys holding the stick, what are the odds that even in the democracies we have good control of those people? Black budget is extremely large, very little democratic accountability. It's not like people get elected on the basis of their relationship with the black state. Nobody stands up and says, I'm going to clean out the defense contractors and that's my policy. On the flip side of that, even inside of the autocracies, like China, it's completely opaque what the real relationship is between the kind of nuclear engineering establishment that maintains the weapons systems and the kind of supreme councils. Do the spooks run the country and have a filter where they only let people become leaders that they're okay with? Or do they just let anybody come into power if that person passes through the system? We don't really know these things. So large-scale, unaccountable power at the heart of the world, and rings of very, very poor feedback loops that surround these things, giving us the general feeling that government in all of its forms is a shambling mess. And I think most people can relate to that. Now, most of the effort from kind of activism has gone into battling the nation state. Right? Even things like Bitcoin, the heart of the Bitcoin story is let's fight the nation state for control of monetary policy, right? Let's make a central bank of the internet, start building some global institutions, sod the nation state. What's interesting about that is it's the beginnings of an approach of trying to simply reconstruct governance above and below the nation state. So if you think of the original Bitcoin thesis as being an attempt to build a global currency, Below the nation state level, you've got things like transition towns and all the relocalization movements that are attempting to build below the nation state. What we're seeing is just the earliest attempts at filling out all of the sort of octaves or registers of government, filling out all of the other scales that governance could occur at. And the hope is that if you begin to build out these systems both above and below the nation state, you can wind up with problem-solving machinery at the same scale as your problems. If you have a global warming problem, you basically have a global warming solution that's implemented globally by something that looks like a global government. At the same time, at the very lowest level, why should an institution larger than, for example, your town be responsible for filling the potholes in your roads or figuring out how often you're going to cut the grass in the parks? Right? It makes very little sense at all that you would wind up with structures which are too big or too small attempting to deal with the problems which are in front of them. And it's that question of scale that I think has been lost in the dialogue around law. So, generally speaking, we have probably 4 structural ways of embodying law. You have at the top level international treaty, then you have national law, then you have contract law, and then you have kind of private off-the-books agreements. And that's basically all there is for law. You could talk a little bit about regulation at things like local government levels, but these things are not really laws. At the global level, the only real actor is the UN, and then you've got a few international treaty bodies, things like WIPO or even the EU, which are kind of below the global level, not quite governments, but they're kind of sitting in that level. You also have the internet steering equipment, right? So you've got things like the Internet Engineering Task Force and the other kind of standardization bodies which are attempting to make global governance decisions at this very, very high level, but again, they're largely advisory. They don't have that much actual power. Then below the nation-state level, you have lots and lots and lots of communities and community groups and community organizations and all the rest of this kind of stuff. But generally speaking, they're locked in a deadlock with local government because local government assumes that the only source of legitimate organization is local government, and groups which are attempting to get things done locally outside of the local government framework typically hit hard limits because local government assumes relatively monopolistic power. There's not a lot of room to start filling in the potholes in your town and have local government say thanks. Right? Generally speaking, they'll stop you. There are a couple of very, very amusing approaches to getting this done, including writing rude words on all the potholes, and then government has to come and remove the rude words. And in the process, they have to acknowledge the existence of the pothole and so on. But short of those kind of guerrilla tactics, there's pervasive disempowerment, except at the nation-state level. Now, this was all well and good right up until public key cryptography got on the scene. Because once you had public key crypto, what you began to get was super empowerment of individuals. In theory, at least, individuals now had the ability to directly communicate outside of any kind of oversight from a nation state. You had absolute privacy. Now, that is almost certainly no longer true, because I think there's decent evidence that the majority of the consumer electronics that you could purchase has been compromised at point of manufacture. But for the sake of argument, let's assume that that's the case. Inside of that sort of structure, the question then is, what do these super empowered individuals choose to do now that they've got the ability to set their own sets of rules? So you have the internet, it's a global structure. The internet was a poor venue for making anything that resembled law until relatively recently. It's not until the advent of the smart contract that you begin to be able to think about doing something that looks like a global law that runs in a global jurisdiction that's directly convened by individuals who are super empowered by public key cryptography. And that, as a political structure, is the political structure which underlies Bitcoin. And if you think of that as being a polity, you kind of have the community of all the people that have the ability to generate a key pair and use it for something. That community then begins to spin up attempts at governing itself. Now, you see how this is basically a geographic argument, right? The question is, what's the venue in which this power is created? And the venue in which this power is created is a global venue. It's the opt-in global venue. And this is all very much 1990s cyberpunk thinking, or cypherpunk thinking, right? The cypherpunks figured this stuff out relatively early. They didn't talk about geography that much. They didn't have a general theory of power. They lacked a lot of the intellectual machinery that you'd want to use for the heavy lifting around this stuff. But the basic model of individuals with private keys forming voluntary associations which have the sort of power of nation states was an old model. Bitcoin is the first attempt to do that. It's, in a sense, a mechanical implementation of a single smart contract. You have a single contract, it's the Bitcoin contract. And you built an entire blockchain to do that. The general instance is something like Ethereum, where you have the ability to do smart contracts. People opt in by doing things like mining or running nodes or having accounts. Then you have the ability to implement contract law. So you can think of Bitcoin as being kind of the equivalent of a constitution, and an individual smart contract is just a contract, and contracts are one of the lower venues of law. Right? So the question is, could you build something that looked kind of like a nation state at this global level? Right? Now, while you're operating in the opt-in sense, you can only exert power over the people who are opt-in citizens of the nation state. And there are lots of things along this line, right? There's BitNation, which is probably the most prominent of these. There are a whole stack of other things behind it. Think again in terms of the geography. You and your private keys operate in a virtual space which has a virtual government which runs on a blockchain, which is implemented as a set of smart contracts. Now, this is where I have to try and make the jump to climate, and it's a little bit fiddly. So, as things currently stand, we don't have a properly constituted global government, right? We have nothing which has the ability to make a law which the nations will be forced to obey. Right? We don't have anything which is capable of making law which individuals will be forced to obey. Even institutions like the UN have very little ability to coerce nation states, which is why you get terrible human rights abuses that run forever in terrible countries. Now, there's almost certainly no way of taking voluntary arrangements between people that are using this kind of, public key cryptography-based voluntary governance and bootstrapping out of that a global authority in a single step. But there might be a way of doing it, and the cryptographer David Chaum is the guy who figured it out. So Chaum figured out that you don't need to ask everybody on Earth what they think in order to be able to get a statistically meaningful global public opinion poll. As long as you're able to accurately, randomly select people from a crowd, you can ask a tiny percentage of the world's population what they want, and from this you can derive political legitimacy. So I think there is a decent chance that if you used the blockchain to manage the evidence for a system like that, where you could provably, fairly, randomly select a person, phone them up and ask them what they thought about a topic, you could begin to build a really well-grounded statistical body of evidence for what humanity as a whole thinks or wants. And nobody's ever done that before, but everybody seems to be in favor of democracy. And if democracy is a good thing, global democracy is surely a better thing. If democracy is a good way of governing a patch of land, it's certainly a better way of governing the earth than a cartel of 200 corporations, each of which happens to be a monopoly landowner on some patch of the earth. It just doesn't make any sense. So the idea that you could basically bootstrap a global government on a blockchain, starting out as something that was a voluntary opt-in opinion polling type system, we randomly phone people who've never even heard of the internet. Hey, you have a phone? Yes, I have a phone. Who's calling me? Oh, well, we're calling from the world government. We want to know what you think about, let's say, tax rates. Right? Much as that sounds like comedy, how else do you build anything that resembles global legitimacy for new power structures? It's certainly not going to come from the nation states unless they have an almighty war and you wind up with a single global hegemon. And if we're not going down that track, how are we going to get there? So if you could build very large-scale pooling of global public opinion as a way of proving what people wanted and what they didn't want, and by the way, this is the kind of thing which is pay for play, so if it costs 2.5 cents for every phone call that you make, groups simply raise money and do the opinion polling. So anybody that wants to ask a question can ask it, anybody can go and get the evidence. You then have to publish all of that data on some kind of blockchain, and then statisticians interpret what it means. Well, your polling is a bit thin in China, you need to make some more phone calls in China, come up with the data. Those kind of models give you the possibility of turning global public opinion into global law. But this global law has no ability to get enforcement at the nation-state level unless nation-states choose to opt in. So what I'd like to suggest as a possible framework is you build one of these very big global democracy machines where you just go out and do massive amounts of telephone-based opinion polling on Chom's model. A set of smart contracts which indicate what people think ought to be done is written, which reflects those laws, and then individuals opt in to take a part of their income or a part of their wealth and manage it under those systems. So, for example, you could do things like voluntarily pay carbon taxes on your Bitcoin, and some kind of notional global governance machine could set the rate of the carbon taxes, and you could prove that you've paid them by putting evidence onto a blockchain showing where exactly you'd paid to get trees planted. And in those kind of ways, you could begin to build up parallel global governance systems that were opt-in systems. And you can imagine that in the same way that fair trade started out as a very, very limited project and now has had a fairly substantial impact on at least one industry, which is coffee, you could just about imagine that you could begin to lay the tracks for this kind of an approach and slowly build up a body of legitimacy and a body of contract law which people could opt into. You know, two parties want to sign a contract. In it, they specify a clause that says the goods provided will be fair trade. That then puts all of the stuff which is happening in that contract under the auspices of the global councils which manage fair trade standards. You put a clause into a contract that says the contract will be in accordance with the global consensus legal structure, and at that point, everything in that contract is subject to the rulings of that body because the contract specifies that we're going to operate under that set of rules. Now, that doesn't free you from the nation state and its own laws. It doesn't make something legal which was previously illegal. You can only add new restrictions to what the nation state puts into play. But for the vast body of commerce, the nation state has very little restriction that affects things like climate. There's really not a lot going on. Likewise, human rights. You can import stuff that's been produced in states which are notorious for slavery and torture, and for the vast majority of the time, the nation state has nothing to say on the matter. So the idea that you could begin to build a body of international standards, implement a smart contracts, and make these opt-in, I can't see a better way of beginning to straighten out the global governance mess. I mean, I've been looking for a leverage point on this stuff for really most of 15 years, and I was completely despairing that there was any leverage point at all because the international system was horrendously broken and nobody was interested in fixing it. It served the interests of the incumbent powers very well. So I think the notion that you could build a sort of global opt-in jurisdiction not based on hard libertarian principles in the same way that the Bitcoin jurisdiction was created, I use jurisdiction very loosely, but based on some kind of representative global democracy based on statistical sampling, that seems pretty credible. What would it cost to get something like this started? Well, depends on the underlying condition of the blockchain technology. If you wind up with a decent scaled global blockchain that seems to work pretty well for large transaction volumes, then it's the price of writing some software to provably fairly randomly select a phone somewhere in the world and call somebody and log the evidence of what happened on the phone call on a chain. $500,000? $1 million? Then you needed enough statistical know-how to be able to say, if we call 1,000 people, how statistically valid is the output from that process? You need at least the first cut of that research. What's that going to cost? Maybe another few $1 million. So at a comfortable budget of $10 million, which is well within the reach of even a relatively unambitious ICO, I think you could begin to build out actual meaningful prototypes for a kind of test it and see if you like it global governance structure. The question then is, how do you get people to opt in? And I think here, much as I hate anything that resembles consciousness raising or discussion of, one day everything will be better than it is now, I think here, desperation has begun to set in among the general public. At least in the circles that I move in, the arrival of Donald Trump has finally run the red flag up the pole, and people are genuinely panicking that we don't seem to be able to take care of our own affairs anymore. So I don't think it'll take much more climate chaos and bad political decision-making to get people into a position where they're really beginning to seriously wonder, what are we going to do? And it's very apparent that international collaboration at the nation-state level isn't working, and that includes the UN. So if we're not going to figure out how to unscrew the global situation at the UN level, what does it take to constitute a new body which has equivalent reach and decision-making power to the UN, but is constituted directly by individuals rather than being constituted as a trade shop for nation states? The UN is explicitly a trade association for the nation state. Individuals have no representation at the global level politically at all, but actually we now have the necessary tooling to build it. And I think that if we're going to pull out of the trap that we're currently in, the idea that you could build global level political representation for individuals and more individuals could voluntarily subscribe to the ruling of those kind of bodies, that doesn't seem like a dumb approach. If you want to know what that might look like in practice, a pretty good parallel kind of peer organization would be the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church has something like, 1.2 billion adherents? And it takes care of an enormous amount of stuff with, paralegal type force for those people, right? What should you do about marriage? What should you do about divorce? What should you do about your sex life? All of these kind of decisions are being made centrally by the Vatican, and people may or may not obey, but there's a system of sanction that goes right down to the village priest, who either will or won't give you communion. You may or may not be damned as a result. So it's not improbable that you could build a global power structure with that kind of reach. We've got one to work with already, and the thing is a couple of thousand years old. So it's durable, it's global, it's old, it reaches right into people's personal lives and tells them what to do, and it certainly has been relatively effective at keeping its show together for a really long time against a lot of opposition, notably Protestantism. So if you had something that was essentially a global environmental and social responsibility church that provably fairly polled its voters on what exactly it was that needed to get done, implemented the decisions of its community as a computer system into which you could then place value in a custodial way, and that entity set things like your effective tax rate or your slavery offsets, Well, it looks like you're working with a country that has a lot of slavery. We've decided that we're going to take 6.5% of the transaction, put that into the following anti-slavery programs. People could sign contracts that would allow them to do business with countries which you otherwise wouldn't do business with, on the basis that those contracts were being overseen by a global organization that was making decisions like that. Right? You could voluntarily have businesses say 75% of our deals are being done in accordance with these global protocols. Right? 100%. It's the new fair trade. What are you doing? Well, we comply with the rulings of our Global Consensus Council. We do as far as possible what we can do to comply with those rulings in all the areas where they contradict our own commercial interest. We are good global citizens. And I think if you think of something that was somewhere between fair trade and the Catholic Church and a modern global democracy movement, there's a chunk of territory out there. Now, I think that territory is much harder to get into than the global central banking business as we saw with Bitcoin, right? Libertarians could constitute a currency with basically, two guys in an Excel spreadsheet, which is more or less how the e-gold currency was started by Doug Jackson in Florida, right? It was one doctor at home with a safe and a spreadsheet, and you could send him gold coins, and from this he bootstrapped a currency. So I'm not saying that there is an easy path to these kind of deliberative systems. You need a large group of people to get involved. You need to raise a chunk of money. You need to do a bunch of political thinking, which hasn't been done. But whoever said that taking over the world was going to be easy, right? It's quite hard for most individuals to look at Bitcoin and see this as something which is unquestionably better than what they've got right now. They don't mind it as a parallel system, but they're certainly not going to put it above them, right? So if we were going to build something that had the ability to build more steering capability than for example, United Nations has, you would need hundreds of millions of people to be voluntarily submitting to the authority of that body. Now, is that a plausible thing? Well, we saw the labor unions, which at one point had that kind of power. We've seen the Catholic Church, which has that kind of power, and then some. The idea that the environmental movement could basically form ranks around a body that was essentially a self-constituted global democracy, and you could take all of this energy that's in the social justice movement and also pour it into the bucket. I mean, God only knows how that would go, but you could give it a try. that sort of model looks to me like something which is midway between a labor union and a democracy. It's a sort of opt-in Sweden, right? Or opt-in Norway. Does that sound even vaguely credible? Well, what's the alternative? Can anybody see a more credible path to building some kind of global governance machinery, given that the nation states are so uncooperative with each other, that we might simply have to have citizens pool together and build something which sits above the nation states? Right? All the templates are there. Chom's work on the subject is fantastic. There are plenty of historical examples of bodies that have this kind of global reach. These things don't have to be thought of as being a threat to governments because they're voluntary and opt-in, and they're a layer which sits beside government. It's parallel in the same way that fair trade is parallel. You don't see governments cracking down on fair trade. Right? And the ability to turn these bodies of law into executable contracts means that it's possible to place trade under the auspices of that kind of global authority. Now, as a plan, obviously I'm just painting this on water, right? It's very, very loosely defined. It sounds like the kind of thing that a science fiction author might sketch out in a pub on the back of a napkin and then go home and wake up the next morning and think, I'm not writing that, right? Nobody would believe it. But if we started to very, very slowly work together on these kind of templates, you had a couple of unconferences over, a year for 3, 4, 5 years, and the blockchain continues to move forward and the political situation continues to get worse. I think you could probably draw together a few hundred to a few thousand people that were interested in making it work and had the necessary technical expertise to figure out the legal and the technical aspects of building a system like that. And those kinds of processes are pretty common in the open source world. We've got lots of bodies which constitute themselves, pull people together, do some thinking, write some reports, have some wikis, have some chat channels, and begin to build up deeper and deeper and deeper understandings of these sort of systems, right? All of the work that's been done on digital identity and self-sovereign identity over the last 15 years has exactly that template, right? So you could do something like that, right? I mean, think of something like Wikipedia. That's an example of a recently constituted body that has about the kind of lifting power you need to get out a draft of the model. Wikipedia's budget is $5 million a year. So relatively manageable spend, intellectual labor of the kind that open source communities are already capable of doing. Even if this is painted on water and even if it's an unrealistic dream, the kind of machinery necessary to take this from an out-of-focus, blurry vision of a possible future to something that was a clear technical proposal is within reach of the kind of communities that are already getting built for all kinds of reasons on the internet already. So I think that if people are interested in building these kinds of machines and starting to have the conversations about what it would take to directly constitute a global democracy from the individual level up as an opt-in body, I think we could have a conference and we could move things in that direction. It would start small and it would either flourish or it would just die. So the final thing that I want to talk about here is a book by a guy called Fred Turner called Apocalypse. And Fred Turner is a poet. But specifically, he's an epic poet. So most cultures, when they were still in the age of gods and monsters, described supernatural forces and greater than human heroes using epic poetry. They didn't go for the novel. The novel was a story about the inside of people and their feelings. Epic poetry was about the outside of people and their doings. And so Turner writes an epic poem about a global consortium that gets together to fix climate change by renegade geoengineering projects. They figure out that it can be done, they figure out the global system isn't doing it, they form an alliance, they marshal the necessary resources, and then they go out and they do it, and they don't ask anybody's permission. And the result is, of course, extremely chaotic, and there's a whole bunch of interaction with people that would quite like them to stop it. Apocalypse really gave me a sense of what was possible if we tried. It has a very nice template for the kind of machineries that you would need to put together to get a project of that kind of scale together, and it's extremely inspiring. So my recommendation is if you're interested in thinking at this kind of level and you need somebody to light a fire under you, read Fred Turner's Apocalypse, have a think about it, and then kind of start looking at the world with new eyes. Because if we're going to get any coherent path out of this mess, it's very unlikely to be something that we're going to get out of the existing forms of democracy, because the machinery of democracy hasn't been updated in 400 years. And if you're going to build a system which is way more responsive than the ballot paper, there's no evidence that any government on earth in the democratic sector is taking seriously those kind of efforts. Even the most progressive of countries are still very stuck on the idea of voting once every 4 years as the only way that citizens get involved in their governance. Maybe in Switzerland you get the occasional plebiscite. But the idea that you could build a modern, responsive system, none of the nation states are taking that seriously as a priority. They will improve everything except the systems which are used to make decisions. So I think that we could reinvent democracy for the global level as a long, slow, careful, disciplined project, largely as academic research rather than as activism. Figure out the statistical models, figure out the necessary software, do a bunch of small tests, raise a little money, spend a little money, raise a little money, spend a little money, and then if it looks pretty plausible, then you start building mass movements and seeing whether you can get enough of the world's economy running under the rules that such a system would create to be a meaningful contributor to building the necessary global consensus to get us out of the climate hole. Because if you can prove that there is a general global appetite for provably clean green businesses which are definitely not contributing to the problems like slavery, if you can show that those businesses are profitable even under the kind of tax regimes necessary to do the cleanup, it becomes possible for nation states to look at those examples and say, okay, so how's about this? We are going to pass equivalent laws to this set of environmental regulations that you guys have, and anybody that's complying with our laws needn't double pay to the global level. And then the nation states can quietly pull that income back down into their own programs. And so you wind up with nation states choosing to opt into the global legal frameworks that were originally constituted by individuals for individuals. Individuals, companies, and nation states could all opt into those global standards over time in much the same way that we did with things like the internet protocol. You opt in one machine at a time when you buy a machine that's compatible and you plug it into the network, and it's the same process whether you're an individual, a corporation, or a country. That's it. Thank you.